Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
There's something uniquely disorienting about watching your own engagement party unravel like a celebration for someone else. Like you're there in a pretty dress, smiling for the cameras, but every time the music swells and people lift their glasses, it's not really for you. It's for the image of you they prefer, the version filtered through other people's expectations, especially hers, my mother's. That night under the tent, lit by warm Edison bulbs strung across the backyard, and surrounded by the kind of laughter that makes you feel like an outsider to your own life, I stood still while guests passed by, congratulating me in the way you might greet a coworker who got promoted. Polite, predictable, and ever so slightly performative. I wore a fitted blue dress that I chose on purpose because it wasn't white, because I knew Olivia wore white at her engagement party, and if I'd worn it too, it would have been another reason for my mother to smile that smile she saves for when she's disappointed but doesn't want to ruin the photo. They say comparison is the thief of joy, but that only counts when the comparison isn't practically tattooed into your DNA. I am the second daughter, always have been, always will be, and even on a day meant to mark the beginning of my own forever, I was being measured against a woman who had already failed at hers. Olivia stood across the lawn near the drink table, laughing with her second glass of Chardonnay, dressed in cream, of course, because boundaries mean nothing when you've grown up being told the sun rises from your eyes. And my mother, Sandra, if I call her what everyone else does, floated between guests like the ghost of a better party, smiling wide, complimenting the caterer, correcting the place settings like it was her name on the invitation. She hadn't hugged me once that day, but she had found the time to tell the florist that roses were a bit cheap-looking and that Olivia's arrangements had more taste. Naturally, it happened during the group photo. You know the kind. Everyone's gathering, the photographers yelling to squeeze in like we're all friends from college and not relatives who barely stand each other. I ended up sandwiched between Jake, my fiancé, and my mom. And in that half second when her arms wrapped around my waist for the shot, she leaned in close to my ear. Her voice was low, sharp, and soft in that rehearsed way people use when they want to make sure you'll hear it, but no one else will. "Don't get cocky," she whispered, with a smirk so subtle it might as well have been invisible to anyone who wasn't raised by it. "Your sister still did it better." That was it, 7 words. Like a blade slipped between my ribs while everyone else smiled. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. My mouth stayed curved into that same fake, polite smile I'd been wearing since the party started, and the camera clicked like it was sealing a moment I'd never forget. My mom pulled away just as the photographer chirped something about one more for safety, and all I could think was how absurd it was that she still, after all these years, thought I needed humbling, as if my entire existence hadn't been one long practice in humility, standing in the shadow of a sister who'd always had the spotlight even when she didn't deserve it. I stood there frozen, surrounded by people clapping and nodding, completely unaware of the fact that I had just been emotionally slapped in the face by the woman who was supposed to be my biggest cheerleader. It wasn't the first time she'd done it, not even close. But something about that moment, maybe the setting, maybe the fact that I had let myself believe, even for a second, that today could just be about me. Something about it made the humiliation hit harder than usual. And you know what's funny? I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I filed it away, tucked it neatly into the mental folder I keep labeled proof, and let the fire burn slow like I always do. Because here's the thing my mother never learned about me in all these years of treating me like the consolation prize. I don't need to win loud. I don't need confetti or applause. What I need is the right moment. And lucky for me, I already knew it was coming. See, what she didn't know, what no one at that party knew, not even Jake, is that 3 days before, a letter arrived at my apartment in a flat white envelope with the Harvard seal in the corner, Graduate School of Education. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I was scared, but because I already had a plan, and that plan required timing. So I slipped that letter into the side pocket of my purse before we left for the party, just in case the opportunity presented itself. just in case she gave me one last little push. And God bless her, she did. But I said nothing then. Not while the servers brought out hors d'oeuvres. Not when Olivia made a toast that turned into a mini eulogy for her own failed marriage, casually inserting herself into my night like she always does. I let it all slide off me like rain on glass. I nodded, smiled, played the part, let Jake hold my hand and talk about honeymoon options with our guests, all while that sentence repeated in my head like a chant. Don't get cocky, your sister still did it better. Did what better? Marry a guy who cheated on her 3 months in? Buy a house she couldn't afford just to outshine her college friends? Make my mother cry at brunch by bringing up how hard it is being a single mom to a golden retriever? I didn't say any of it. I didn't say a damn word. But I didn't forget it either. So when it came time for our thank you speech, when Jake handed me the mic and smiled like he always does, trusting me without question, I took a deep breath and looked out at the crowd, my guests, my night, my moment. And I let the silence hang for half a second longer than it needed to, because sometimes revenge doesn't have to be cruel. Sometimes it just has to be clever. And if you wait long enough, if you play your cards close and bite your tongue when it matters, the payoff is better than anything applause can give you. But that part comes next. You don't just wake up one day and realize your mother doesn't love you the same way she loves your sister. It happens gradually, like water wearing away stone, not in loud explosions but in subtle emissions, repeated glances, tiny moments of hesitation that begin to stitch together a pattern you can't unsee once the thread finally tugs tight. I think I was about 9 when I first started to notice it. Not in any grand or dramatic way, just in the way a child can feel the temperature shift in a room when their sibling enters, how the light seems to gather around them, and how suddenly the grown-ups seem more attentive, more animated, like their very presence has turned the ordinary into something deserving of celebration. Olivia could walk into the kitchen and announce she had gotten a B on a history quiz, and my mother would beam like she'd just been admitted to Yale. I could come home with a perfect score and a commendation from the principal, and I'd get a quiet, "That's nice, dear," as she turned back to folding laundry or stirring sauce that didn't need stirring. It was never about one moment, and that's what makes it so insidious, because it's easier to explain a single cruel sentence than it is to describe the ache that comes from being consistently unseen. There wasn't a fight or a blow-up or a slammed door. It was 1,000 paper cuts from a woman who swore she was treating us equally. Olivia got new shoes before the school year started, ones she picked out from a catalog, the kind that weren't on sale, and I got a gently used pair from the thrift store down the block because kids your age grow out of shoes so fast, it's not worth spending full price. Olivia got a birthday party at the skating rink with a tiered cake and 16 girls screaming Taylor Swift, and I got a family dinner at home with candles and that same pasta she always made when she didn't want to try. And even then, even with all that, I told myself for years that maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I wasn't as sparkly as Olivia. Maybe I didn't ask for enough. Maybe if I was louder or more fashionable or got better grades or wore makeup earlier or didn't read so much or wasn't so quiet around her friends or smiled more or wore red like Olivia did, she'd finally look at me with that same sparkle in her eyes, that same unguarded affection. I spent most of my teenage years quietly rearranging myself like furniture, trying to take up less space but somehow be more noticeable, hoping one day I'd get it right. But every time I tried, it always came back to the same script. Olivia just has a natural presence. Olivia was always more confident. Olivia knows what she wants. I remember the day Olivia got into Stanford, and my mother wept like someone had handed her the moon. She called every aunt, every cousin, even the neighbor who once stole our recycling bins, just to brag. She printed out the acceptance letter and laminated it, hung it on the fridge like a trophy. When I got into Northwestern a few years later, early decision, I told her in the kitchen while she was slicing cucumbers, and she said, "That's nice, honey," without even turning around. And I think that was the moment something inside me quietly snapped. Not in a rage, not in some dramatic teenage outburst, but in a quiet, resigned way, Like realizing a door you've been trying to open for years was never locked. It just wasn't meant for you. I didn't hate Olivia. That's the twisted part. She wasn't cruel. In fact, she was often generous with her praise of me, like an older girl indulging a younger one. And she never rubbed anything in my face. She didn't have to. Her existence was the reminder. And deep down, I think she knew what was happening, even if she never said it. She never told Mom to stop comparing us. She never pointed out when something felt unfair. She just smiled, accepted the pedestal, and occasionally tossed me breadcrumbs of sisterly affection, which I devoured like a starving dog. By the time I was 25, Olivia had already been married once, divorced once, bought a house she couldn't afford, gotten a job at a high-profile law firm through a college roommate's father, and hosted Thanksgiving 2 years in a row like she was the matriarch of the family, even though she couldn't cook anything that didn't come from Trader Joe's. And my mother, oh, my mother worshipped it all. She talked about Olivia's resilience, her taste, her poise, as though being left by a cheating hedge funder was somehow a noble accomplishment. And meanwhile, I had moved into a decent apartment in a modest neighborhood, working as a curriculum designer for a nonprofit, quietly paying off my loans, building something slowly, something real, but none of it glittered, and glitter was what my mother understood. So I stopped trying. I stopped bringing up promotions, or projects, or conferences. I let her talk about Olivia during phone calls that always began with, "I don't have long." I learned to hold my own joy gently, not because I was ashamed, but because I knew it would be crushed if I handed it over too freely. I dated quietly, I failed quietly, I succeeded quietly. And I smiled at every wedding, every baby shower, every birthday party where Olivia stole the room, even when I had nothing left to give. But here's the thing about living in the shadows for too long. It sharpens your vision. You start to see the cracks in the marble. You start to understand how people move, how their insecurities cling to them like perfume, and how silence can be a weapon when used properly. That's what they don't tell you about being the overlooked one. You learn patience. You learn timing. And when the moment comes, you don't need to scream. You don't need to argue. You just need to say the one thing they never expected you to say, at the exact right time. That's why when the Harvard envelope arrived, I didn't open it right away. I stared at it, held it like a secret, let it sit on my coffee table for hours like a landmine no one else could see. And when I finally opened it and read the words I had been hoping for, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just smiled, folded the letter, and placed it gently back inside. Because for once, I knew exactly how the story was going to end. And it wasn't going to end quietly. 3 weeks before the engagement party, before the tent and the whisper and the glass of Chardonnay, Olivia would spill on her cream dress without even noticing. I stood in my kitchen, barefoot, staring down at the kind of envelope that doesn't come unless you've done something people consider important. And I remember, more vividly than any birthday or family gathering, how quiet the room felt in that moment, as though the air itself had paused to wait with me. It was a heavy envelope, thick and official, bearing the Harvard seal in deep red at the top left corner. And though I had been expecting it, because I don't submit applications I'm not fully prepared to win, I still couldn't bring myself to open it right away. There was something sacred about it, something private, something I wanted to preserve for just a little while longer, before sharing it with a world that had never once clapped loudly for me, unless Olivia was standing nearby. The decision to apply hadn't been impulsive, nor had it been born from some desperate need to prove anything to anyone, at least not on the surface. It had started one evening during the tail end of winter, when Jake was out of town for a conference, and I had a rare Saturday to myself. I was scrolling mindlessly through job listings, wondering if I had reached the ceiling of my career without even noticing, and then, in a moment that felt less like inspiration and more like inevitability, I found the program. Harvard Graduate School of Education, Masters in Human Development and Psychology. And the description read like someone had put my unspoken ambitions into a perfect, tailored paragraph. It wasn't just about getting a better job, or the prestige, or even the name that my mother would never be able to ignore. It was about finally doing something entirely mine, separate from Olivia, separate from anyone's expectations. Something that reflected the woman I had become, not the girl who used to watch her sister twirl under the chandelier at every holiday party while I cleared the plates. And so I applied, meticulously, quietly, deliberately, poring over my personal statement for weeks, tweaking every sentence until it sang with purpose, crafting my resume like a surgeon, gathering recommendations from people who saw me for who I really was. And when I finally submitted it, I did so without ceremony. There was no announcement, no social media post, not even a mention to Jake, who would have been supportive but distracted, already juggling details for our engagement party. It was something I did for myself, a seed I planted in silence, because I knew, somehow, I'd need it later. And when the envelope finally arrived, I felt the weight of all those silent moments gathering in my chest, like steam building under a lid. I didn't open it that day. I placed it on the table and made tea. I listened to music. I cleaned the bathroom. I folded laundry with mechanical focus, as though completing these ordinary tasks could somehow give me more control over what the envelope would say, even though I knew the answer already. And when Jake came home later that night, tired and smiling and asking what I'd done all day, I kissed him, told him not much, and tucked the envelope into the drawer beneath the bills, where it wouldn't be disturbed. A few days later, he proposed. It was simple, sweet, and very Jake. On a Sunday afternoon at the park where we first met, with a modest ring he had chosen himself, and a speech that made me laugh and cry in equal measure. And when I said yes, I meant it. Not just because I loved him, but because I believed in us, in our strange, quiet partnership, in the way he had never once made me feel like I was second best. The news spread fast, of course, and within 24 hours my phone was buzzing with texts, calls, group messages, and unsolicited Pinterest boards from friends and family members I hadn't spoken to in months. And in the middle of it all, predictably and perfectly on cue, Olivia called. She didn't start with congratulations. She never does. She opened with a half-joking, "Wow, didn't think you were the marrying type," followed by a soft laugh that wasn't quite malicious, but still managed to land like a slap. Then she asked about the ring, about the venue, about whether Mom had cried when she heard, because of course it's always about Mom's reaction, isn't it? I answered her questions politely, firmly, with just enough distance to make sure she couldn't twist anything into a game. And by the end of the call, she managed to slip in a reference to her own engagement party, to the floral arrangements she curated herself, to the menu that people still talk about. And I realized then, with a clarity that almost startled me, that Olivia wasn't cruel because she wanted to hurt me. She was cruel because she didn't even realize she was doing it. That's what happens when no one ever tells you no, when your mediocrity is dressed up as brilliance, when your failures are reframed as experiences, and your mistakes are recast as misfortunes. You forget that other people bleed too. You forget that they remember things you barely noticed. Planning the party was easy, mostly because I stayed out of the way. My mother and Olivia took the reins before I could even blink, arguing over linens, tasting wines, picking colors based on the season and not my preferences. I let them. I smiled and nodded and signed checks and pretended I cared, because none of it really mattered. What mattered was the envelope in my drawer. What mattered was that for once, I had something that no one else had touched. Not Olivia, not Mom, not even Jake. I knew I would bring it to the party, not because I planned to announce anything, not at first, but because I sensed, deep in that gut-level place where instinct lives, that the moment would come. The moment where someone, most likely Mom, would say something just cruel enough, just calculated enough, to push me over the edge, and I wanted to be ready. I wanted to be the girl who didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't walk away. I wanted to be the woman who had the last word, quietly, precisely, and with enough force to echo in the silence that would follow, because I had waited my whole life for a moment that belonged to me, and I wasn't about to let them take this one too. There's a strange kind of silence that falls over a room right before someone makes a speech, especially when that room is filled with people who think they already know what you're going to say, who believe the next few minutes will be pleasant and predictable. A string of polite gratitude, a few compliments to the caterer, a loving nod to your partner, a gentle wave to the parents, and then a quick clink of glasses before the music resumes and everyone returns to the comfort of their conversations. That's what they expected from me. Another quiet, graceful performance from the girl who never asked for attention, who let others shine while she stood just far enough in the background to make her presence comfortable rather than commanding. And for most of the night, I gave them exactly that. I smiled at the right people, laughed at the right jokes, and thanked everyone who complimented the food, even though I hadn't chosen a single dish. I hugged relatives I barely knew, stood still while Mom adjusted the hem of my dress with the same distracted fussiness she reserved for setting the holiday table, and I let Olivia tell story after story that ended with some version of her saving the day, all while pretending I hadn't noticed how the spotlight somehow always finds her no matter where she stands. But under that tent, surrounded by the soft glow of string lights and the scent of overcooked salmon, I felt a low hum in my chest, a quiet tremble of something ancient and angry that had lived in me for years, but had never been given a voice. And I knew, down to my bones, that the time had come not to scream, not to rage, but to speak with a calmness so unsettling it would echo louder than any outburst ever could. Jake took the microphone first, of course, because that's how these things usually go, and he spoke from the heart in the way only someone who hasn't been trained to measure every word can. He talked about how we met, about how I challenged him from the very beginning, how he loved my stubbornness even before he fully understood it, and how he felt lucky every day to be the man I chose. He made people laugh, made them tear up a little, and as he turned to me with that steady, open smile that never asks for anything more than honesty, he handed me the mic with a simple, "Your turn, babe." And so I took it. I stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle, feeling every eye in the space turn toward me, some with genuine affection, others with passive curiosity, and a few, especially hers, with carefully disguised expectation. I thanked everyone first, in the way one does when playing by the rules, thanking the guests for coming, thanking the friends who helped organize, giving a sweet nod to Jake for being the calm in my storm. And for a moment, it felt like any other speech. Me performing what was expected, me walking the narrow line of polite femininity, me being small. But then I turned, just slightly, and my eyes landed on her. My mother in her perfect dress, with her perfect posture and her perfectly unbothered expression. And without raising my voice or changing my tone, I delivered the sentence I had been rehearsing for 3 weeks. The sentence that was neither cruel nor loud, but carried the weight of 1,000 swallowed insults. "And Mom," I said, pausing long enough to feel the air shift, "the letter from Harvard arrived." There was no gasp, no dropped glass, just a subtle, almost imperceptible stillness that moved through the crowd like a breeze before a storm. Her face, usually composed to the point of rigidity, faltered for a split second, just enough for me to see it, just enough to know it landed. Her lips tightened, her eyebrows twitched upward. The corners of her mouth curled in confusion before freezing in a smile that had suddenly lost its anchor. And Olivia, standing a few feet away, tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in that calculating way she has when trying to determine if the conversation has suddenly left her out. I didn't elaborate. I didn't say what program. I didn't say I had been accepted. I didn't say I had outworked every single expectation they'd ever placed on me while they were too busy fussing over Olivia's latest crisis to notice I'd built an entire future out of resilience and precision. I just let it hang there, subtle and surgical, a truth so sharp in its simplicity that even the people who didn't fully understand it could feel the tremor it caused. Someone at a table near the back clapped awkwardly, thinking maybe it was part of the thank you list. But no one joined in. The silence returned quickly, and in that moment, I felt it. Not victory exactly, but something more complicated and far more satisfying. It was the kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying to win a game that was never meant for you and decide instead to write your own rulebook. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't defending. I was stating a fact that required no applause, no permission, and no validation. I smiled. Not at my mother, not at Olivia, not at the guests who now looked politely uncomfortable. I smiled at Jake, who, bless him, didn't fully understand what I had just done, but knew me well enough to squeeze my hand beneath the table as I passed him the mic and sat back down. The rest of the night unfolded like a play, where the actors had forgotten their lines. Conversations stuttered. Olivia didn't tell another story. My mother made 2 attempts to rally a new topic, both of which fell flat. The music resumed, of course, because nothing ever stops completely when family is watching. But the energy had shifted. I could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way my mother's wine glass stayed half full, in the way Olivia suddenly excused herself to the bathroom and didn't return for a full 20 minutes. I didn't gloat. I didn't walk around fishing for reactions. I let them sit with it, let them wonder, let them play the scene over in their heads again and again, trying to decode the meaning behind the words. Because that's what happens when you've underestimated someone for too long. You forget they were paying attention. You forget they have their own timing, their own rhythm, their own power. And in that moment, I had never felt more powerful. Not because I had finally earned her approval, because I hadn't, and likely never would. Not because I had embarrassed her, because revenge isn't about humiliation, but because I had finally said something that didn't require her to believe it in order for it to be true. That was my moment, and I took it. There's something unsettling about the quiet that follows a confrontation not marked by yelling or slammed doors, but by a single sentence that shifts the axis of a room, leaving everyone to pretend that nothing has changed when in fact everything already has. That night, after the speech had ended and the last toast had been forced from trembling hands raised just a second too late, the air in the tent felt denser, as if the fabric of civility everyone had worn so comfortably for the first few hours had become suffocating, now clinging to skin instead of covering it, revealing the fault lines beneath the surface with terrifying clarity. People didn't look at me the same way anymore, not because they suddenly respected me, though a few certainly did, but because they weren't sure where I stood in the hierarchy they had assumed was fixed. I was no longer the agreeable younger daughter, the polite shadow trailing behind Olivia, the quiet one who nodded and moved on. I was something different now, something unpredictable. And in families like mine, unpredictability is never welcome. It's treated like a virus, something that must be contained before it spreads. After the speech, there wasn't a dramatic confrontation, no showdown behind the tent, or whispered argument in the kitchen. Instead, there was distance, physical and emotional, woven through every moment that followed like invisible thread. My mother didn't approach me, not once, though she hovered in my peripheral vision for the rest of the evening, speaking too loudly to people who weren't really listening, laughing just a beat too late at jokes that didn't land, clutching her wine glass like a lifeline while carefully avoiding my gaze. Olivia, for her part, disappeared completely for a long stretch of time, and when she finally re-emerged, she looked composed but vacant, her smile fixed, her presence quieter than usual, as if something in her had short-circuited and she didn't quite know how to reboot. She didn't come over to talk to me. She didn't make any more toasts. She didn't brag or interject, or try to steer the attention back toward herself, which might have been the most unsettling shift of all. Jake noticed, of course. He may not have known the full history behind the moment, but he knows me, and he knows when the room tilts. As the guests began to trickle out and the music softened into background noise, he leaned in close, his voice low and careful, asking me if I was okay, and I nodded because I was strangely, wonderfully okay in a way I hadn't been in years. I was calm, centered, grounded in the quiet power of someone who has finally stopped asking for permission to exist fully. I squeezed his hand and told him I'd explain everything later, and he didn't press because that's who he is. Steady, kind, the eye of every storm I've ever known. And maybe that's why I could do what I did. Because I knew, no matter how the rest of the world shifted, Jake would remain my constant. The guests left in waves, some too quickly, others too slowly, their small talk a little more awkward than usual, their compliments slightly strained. A few close friends offered long hugs and knowing glances, but no one said anything directly because no one knew quite what they were reacting to. They only knew that something had happened. My father, as expected, said nothing all night. He had stood near the back for most of the evening, nursing a beer and watching the crowd with the same quiet detachment he'd always worn like armor. But as Jake and I were gathering the last of the gifts and preparing to leave, he walked over, placed his hand gently on my shoulder and said, almost too softly to hear, "Took you long enough." Then he turned and walked away. That sentence, from a man who rarely spoke more than he needed to, hit harder than anything else that night, not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. He had known all along. He had seen it year after year. The imbalance, the favoritism, the slow erosion of my confidence beneath my mother's relentless comparisons and Olivia's accidental monopoly on attention. And he had said nothing, done nothing, and now, with just 5 words, he acknowledged all of it. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. I felt something heavier, something deeper, something that would take years to name and even longer to unpack. Back home, Jake asked again if I wanted to talk about it, and I started to, but then stopped, because how do you explain decades of being quietly dismissed in a single conversation? How do you articulate the feeling of winning a private war you never should have had to fight in the first place? Instead, I told him the truth, that I had gotten into Harvard, that I had applied months ago, that I hadn't told anyone because I wasn't sure when or how I'd want to reveal it. I told him it wasn't about the degree, not really, but about the choice to do something for myself, to move toward a life where I wasn't always reacting to someone else's spotlight. He listened, and when I was done, he didn't tell me I was right or brave or smart. He just pulled me into a hug and said, "You're finally free." And that, more than anything, felt like the ending I had earned. And yet, even now, weeks later, I'm still not sure what comes next. I haven't spoken to my mother since the party. There was no phone call, no apology, no passive-aggressive email pretending nothing happened. Just silence. Olivia sent a text 2 days later, short, vague, a non-statement that read like something she felt obligated to send but didn't want to discuss. I didn't reply. I don't know if I will. Part of me wants to believe that maybe, just maybe, the silence is the beginning of something different. A shift in the dynamic we've all been too afraid to name. But a louder part of me knows better. Some stories don't end in reconciliation. Some wounds don't heal just because the bleeding stops. Sometimes, walking away is the only resolution you're ever going to get. And so I keep the letter from Harvard tucked inside my desk drawer. Not as a trophy, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A reminder that I don't have to wait for someone else to validate my worth. A reminder that I am no longer the girl who needed her mother's approval to breathe deeply. A reminder that the life I want isn't a stage I have to share with anyone who doesn't want to see me clearly. But here's what I still haven't told anyone, not even Jake. I haven't officially accepted the offer yet. I haven't filled out the paperwork. I haven't made the call, because deep down, a part of me wonders, do I really want to go? Or did I just need to know I could? Maybe the power was never in the acceptance. Maybe it was in choosing when and how and if I tell the world. Maybe, just maybe, the silence is mine now. And maybe that's enough.